Welcome to the Great Language Partner podcast. I'm Katja.
And I'm Nicole. We are two neurodiversity affirming speech therapists on a mission to bring joy to your autistic child's communication journey.
Separately, we've helped hundreds of neurodivergent kids become confident communicators, but we know we can make an even bigger impact together. Whether you're a parent or professional, we're here for you as you navigate your unique journey.
We'll talk all things Gestalt language development, sensory processing, and beyond as we share practical tips and inspiring stories to help you become your child or student's greatest language partner.
Let's create a more understanding, supportive, and affirming world for autistic kids.
One conversation at a time. All right, so we're here to talk about the basics, right, Katya? How are you?
Good, how are you?
Oh, I am just peachy, just coming off the tail of a 2-hour presentation on Gestalt language development. And so we're going to jump right into talking about Gestalt language development, our favorite topic.
Yeah, I've given this kind of beginner spiel about what is Gestalt language, what are the stages that we always talk about, but we realized we haven't done it on here yet, and it'd probably be a good thing for some of our listeners to have who aren't super familiar. So yeah, let's give the spiel again.
Here comes the spiel. So I mean, again, I feel like to us, it seems so basic, but even still, I feel like the more we talk about it, the more nuance gets uncovered. So yeah, I know the first time I ever heard of Gestalt language processing was, 5 years ago maybe, and there was another speech therapist who shared a client with me, and she said, well, he's a Gestalt language processor, but I had no idea what she said because I had never heard of it. And I was like, oh, of course. Like, I just played along. I didn't know what to say because I didn't want to look stupid. And so she was like, a GLP, are you familiar with Marge Blanc? And I was just like, yeah, of course I am. But I had no idea what Gestalt language processing was. So don't be like me. If you're listening, don't just pretend to know. But once I started to look into it and do the research and read the book and take the courses, I was like, oh, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. So I guess we should start by talking about what Gestalt language processing is.
Yeah. What does it mean to be a Gestalt language processor? I always start with comparing analytic language to Gestalt language because I feel like understanding the difference between the two helps us understand what Gestalt language is. So we believe that there are two ways to process language, right? There's the analytic language processing, and then there's our Gestalt language processing. To put it simply, analytic language processing is what we see as typical language development. However, both are natural and typical and common, both analytic and Gestalt. But analytic is what most of us, speech therapists or not, understand as language processing. Kids, babies learn single words, and then as they become toddlers, they take those single words and they start to combine them into 2-word combos and then 3-word combos and so on until they can produce grammar. So right away, these analytic processors, which are sometimes called word babies, see these single words as building blocks for grammar right away, as single units of meaning that they can add together. GLPs don't really do that. Maybe you can chat about what a Gestalt processor does instead.
Yeah. So I like to think about it like from a really practical perspective of like when a GLP first starts to communicate, they're not necessarily, like you said, they're not using those single words, and they're not hearing those single words when they are taking in language from the environment. What they are doing is they're lifting and picking up language from the environment in these strings of intonation, these chunks of language. So I always think about the example of 5 little monkeys jumping on the bed. So an analytic language processor, their first word in that respect might be monkey. Like they might see a monkey and say monkey. Like I know with my son, who I believe is an analytic processor, he would see an animal and label the animal. So when an analytic language processor is starting to communicate, they would say an animal name, for example, monkey, and that is their way of labeling the monkey. A GLP, on the other hand, might sing the Five Little Monkeys Jumping on the Bed song, but it's all one chunk, right? It's like they're not necessarily hearing or understanding or using each of the words within that. It's kind of like Five Little Monkeys Jumping on the Bed is one single unit of meaning. And so GLPs start with these chunks of language or these gestalts. And I know in the past few years, I have worked and reworked my definition of Gestalt to try to make it clearer to people, because I think it can be a little complicated to explain how it's different from delayed echolalia, or how it's a little bit, more nuanced than just repeating something. And so what our GLPs do in that first stage of language is they are using these gestalts, which we have traditionally called scripts or delayed echolalia, but they are using them to kind of encompass an experience or a really rich emotional or otherwise meaningful context, right? Or experience. So I know I just recently shared this visual on social media about what a gestalt really might mean for a child. And so many people are like, can you send it to me? Can I have this? So we'll put it in the show notes, actually, if anybody wants a copy of it. But let me kind of describe it a little bit, because it seems to have been an example that a lot of people really understood. I think we have all been in the situation where people are singing happy birthday to us and it feels so awkward and uncomfortable. So basically, if you've ever seen the visual of the iceberg kind of analogy for things, where an iceberg, what we see is what's above the surface of the water, right? But below the surface, the iceberg exists as well. And so above the water, for a language gestalt iceberg, we hear the child say, happy birthday to you. And this example came from one of my clients, right? So anytime they were feeling dysregulated, they would sing the song happy birthday, or they might just say happy birthday to you. So we noticed, okay, you're dysregulated, you're upset, you're frustrated, you're anxious, and we hear you say this. And so it's not literal. We know our Gestalt language processors in that first stage of natural language acquisition, they use Gestalts, and we have to kind of try to uncover what's going on below the water for that iceberg. What is that gestalt really encompassing for the child? So in this visual, under the water, it says what the child actually is trying to convey. And so I wrote things like the anxiety of having everybody staring at them at their birthday party while they were singing happy birthday. The way that the sound of everybody's voices together was hurting their ears because it was off pitch and it didn't sound good to the child. The way that they had to stop playing to come have people sing happy birthday to them. The way they were in a new environment for their birthday party and they were unsure and the lights were bright and there was icing on their hands. So this gestalt, what we see above the water, is not always really what the child is trying to convey below the surface. And the visual, I think, really landed for people because of the fact that, like, everybody feels awkward when people sing to them, right? So you can kind of put yourself in that child's position of that's why they're saying that gestalt when they're experiencing that emotion. So a lot of times for GLPs, their first unit of meaning, these gestalts, they're using them to convey or encompass this whole experience that has more personal, emotional, or meaningful relevance to them. And it doesn't always sound like what they mean, right?
Yeah. And I love that example. If you're interested in doing and learning how to do that detective work of figuring out what is below the iceberg with some of these gestalts or scripts or delayed echolalia that we're hearing, we have a whole episode about doing the detective work. So check that out. But yeah, essentially, Gestalt language processors use delayed echolalia to communicate. And that delayed echolalia, like you're sharing, is if it has a deeper meaning, we call it a gestalt. So gestalt processors use these gestalts or chunks of delayed echolalia to communicate, at least in the early stages. And we keep mentioning these stages. We'll
Yeah, so what
describe.
happens next? What happens next, Katya?
Yeah, you talked about how they pick up on these intonational chunks, and that's why
Yeah.
we can call GLPs intonation babies versus the analytic processors are word babies. GLPs are not picking up on those single words and seeing them as building blocks for grammar until later. They're picking up on this intonation, that intonational chunk, that whole song, and that for them holds that single unit of meaning. Yeah, I can give my natural language acquisition stages spiel.
Please do.
Yeah. So the way we support Gestalt language processors is helping them to move through the natural language acquisition stages. That's our overall goal, but there's lots of supports that go into each of these individual stages, and many kids will stay in the early stages for quite some time. Not every child moves through all of these stages that I'll mention, but the natural language or NLA stages, which you hear us talk about often and will hear us continue to talk about. This is essentially the progression that GLPs naturally make to go from delayed echolalia or using gestalts all the way to self-generated grammar. So you mentioned stage one. Stage one of NLA is when Gestalt processors use delayed echolalia. So they're using gestalts to communicate, like singing happy birthday to you to say that they are overwhelmed. That is a gestalt. Gestalts can be as short as a single word or as long as a whole movie, but it's often these phrase level chunks of delayed echolalia or what we might call scripts. So kids in stage one are mainly communicating with those chunks of language. Then in stage two, they become a little more flexible with their gestalts and they start to break them down or mitigate them. So you might hear the term mitigating, which essentially means breaking down or mix and matching these original gestalts or chunks of language into something slightly new. And there's different ways that they might mitigate, but perhaps their original gestalt was, this cake is so yummy. And now they can say, this pizza is so yummy. This pasta is so yummy. This cookie is so yummy. That is an example of a stage two. So the child takes their original phrase and is able to change it up a little bit. That's what's happening in stage two. And it's not totally their own grammar. It's not, them taking word plus word plus word and creating their own thought, but it is slightly more on topic and relevant than maybe their original gestalt was. And I say this often because it's true. Kids get really good at stage two, and I'm sure you've witnessed this, especially in our older GLPs. Some kids get so good at mixing and matching and breaking down their gestalts and combining them in different ways. Because sometimes it looks like switching out a word. Sometimes it looks like taking a little chunk of this one and a little chunk of this one and turning it into something new. But so many kids get so good at that it's hard to even tell if that's what they're doing or if it is their own self-generated grammar. And I see a lot of parents and therapists get confused and think the child is totally creating their own grammar because it is super relevant to what's going on and very flexible. So it can take some knowledge about Gestalt language and really looking at the child's history to know for sure that it is more the stage two mitigation.
I remember you shared a strategy. I don't know if it was on the podcast or on social media or just in our conversations where you mentioned, because one of the things that we do to sort of track where our GLPs are is we keep language samples, right? We write down what we hear the child say, and then we, using the NLA framework, we can kind of score these samples based on the stages. But you shared that you do these on a spreadsheet, and so that you can kind of search through for chunks of language to see, like, is this a really savvy stage two or is this self-generated grammar? Because if you take a language sample, for example, and let's say they use a sentence and you're not sure if they fully generated it themselves, so you search through your previous samples and you start to see that kind of beginning of that sentence coming up over and over again, you know that that is part of a gestalt that they are mixing and matching as opposed to truly self-generated language. So I remember you shared that because I think a lot of us are probably wishing we had more time to do all these language samples and to really analyze them, to do them justice. But time-saving tips like that, I think, are really helpful.
Yeah, I know I talk about that in my grammar for GLP's course. And the example I gave there was I heard a child say what seemed like a new phrase to me. It was like, I gotta get the crayons, or I gotta get the red crayon. And that could totally be self-generated grammar. They could be putting together I, gotta, get, and seeing those all as single words and, totally piecing those together to create their own grammar. Or they could have had a gestalt that was, I gotta get the red crayon, and that could have been a stage 1 piece that they are echoing from someone else. Or it could be a stage 2. Maybe the original gestalt was, I gotta get the blue crayon, and now they're changing it to, I gotta get the red crayon. And yeah, there's really no way to know for sure unless you are able to look back in their language history. So for that kid, I searched for I gotta get, and lo and behold, in their language sample, there was I gotta get the red crayon, I gotta get the blue crayon, I gotta get the red marker. So it was clear that those were stage 2s. It had the same frame and they were changing out the color or the object. But if you see those repetitive frames, that is really often what sets stage 2 apart. But yeah, learning how to do that language sampling and deciphering all of that can take some time. But
So what happens next? You're keeping us on the edge of our seats here.
um, once kids get really good at mixing and matching and they're using stage 2, we say about 50% of the time. So if you take 100 utterance language sample and 50 of those are falling into the stage 2 category, they're mixing and matching, then they will naturally start to move to stage 3. And in stage 3, it's essentially a further mitigation stage. They're breaking down these pieces even more. And for the first time, they're isolating single words and they're seeing single words as these, what I call building blocks for language, or what you could call an isolated unit of language. Before then, your DLP might use single words. However, until this stage 3 sort of brain shift that we seem to witness, they're not seeing that single word as a building block. So they might have, I see so many GLPs who have tons of like labels, single word labels, but they're not putting them together to create grammar. And it's because they're probably not at that stage 3 kind of shift where they're seeing it as a building block. But once they get to stage 3, that will start to happen. And then we hear 2 and 3 word combinations. And in stage 3, we're really focused on nouns and descriptive words for the most part. Lots of 2 word combinations, lots of noun plus noun. And stage 3 can look so different for different kids. Sometimes kids move through it in a matter of days. Other kids need months of support there. So it really depends on the child and their language history. But that stage 3 is so different than the first 2 stages. It sounds so different in quality. They're really, for the first time, thinking about taking this word and piecing it together to create something referential and something new. And once they spend a lot of time there, or maybe not a lot of time, but adequate time for them, they start to move to grammar and they'll add in verbs. And this is stage 4. So stage 4 is pretty early grammar. It kind of sounds like toddler-like grammar, even if it's a teenager. She eats pizza. I jump. We play. This ball there. Stage 4, early stage 4 stuff sounds very simple grammar. And then in stage 5 and 6, it just gets more and more and more complex. And once a child is in stage 6 of these natural language acquisition stages, they can essentially say whatever they want. Their grammar is very complex, and they're done with the grammar acquisition piece of language. There might still be other language goals that you could support them with, like telling stories or whatever it may be, but that language piece will be mastered for the most part. So, yeah, essentially there's 6 stages, and these kids go from delayed echolalia all the way to self-generated grammar, and it is quite the journey. And you and I talk a lot about supporting the early stages, but I'm sure we will get into it all eventually.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest questions that I get asked by parents is, well, when will my child get to the next stage? Or, will my child be able to be conversational? And I like to look at the stages like a framework, like a guide. I think that makes the most sense, where it's great to know what the child will go through, what their language development might look like, right? But not every child will move through the stages in the exact way that they're laid out in a time frame that is consistent for everybody, right? Like every child will move through the stages at their own pace, and some kids will stay in stage one for a lot longer, and some kids will move quickly. I've seen it go both ways, and I always want to be as transparent, I think, with parents as possible, that, like, that depends on so many factors, and we don't have, there's not one black and white answer to that, but it's really about knowing the stages and understanding what development looks like so that we can show up for the child wherever they are in each stage and provide the right kind of support. Because I think in learning over the past several years, in really understanding how to support kids at each stage, it's a lot of work for us too as communication partners, because while the child moves from stage one to stage two, then our supports have to shift a little bit, and then when they get to stage three, our supports have to shift even more. It's less modeling a full, potential gestalt from the child's perspective, and more of that, like, single word and noun plus noun and those 2-word combos. And it's like we have to be providing the right kinds of supports for our GLPs at each stage, which is why it's important to know these things. But the other thing that I always like to tell people is, like, we also don't want to get ourselves so fixated on where a child is in the stages, because they're going to be in several stages at once. I mean, whenever I score a language sample, it's very rarely like, oh, they're in stage 1 75% and stage 2 25%. It might be like, a little bit of 1, a lot of 2, 1 or 2 stage 3s. Like, they start to emerge, I think. And so kids will be in several stages at once, and I think we've had many parents in my clinic come and say, well, last language sample, the child was, in stage 2 for most of it, and today it's like mostly stage 1. Are they regressing? Are they going backwards? And I like to just remind parents that, like, there are so many factors at play, and we want to be, like, zooming out a little bit and looking at the overall progression, right? We don't want to get so granular. And I think that if you're a parent who's already anxious, I think that sometimes that kind of adds to your plate of
Yeah.
things to worry about, right? So it's important to know these things, and I think it really helps inform us on how to support these kids. But, there's also, I like what you said about there being a lot of progress to be made within each stage, right? Because kids can get really savvy and they can have a lot of autonomy, even if they stay in stage 1 or stage 2.
Yep. There's so many things to celebrate every stage. And yeah, some kids don't make it through all of the stages. It really depends on a lot of factors, how far they're going to move. And every child or adult, wherever you're starting in your GLP journey, has the possibility of getting there, but it can be a long route. But even moving from stage 1 to 2 leads to so much flexibility. But yeah, I agree that parents and therapists get caught up in the stages,
It's
and
hard
it
not
can,
to.
yeah, it can feel like a lot of pressure. You mentioned that these kids are often in several stages at once, and it can kind of ebb and flow. And I think it's important to mention that, yeah, it is natural to be in many, if not all of the stages at once, or at least a smattering of 1 through 4. That seems kind of random. And I'm often getting asked, well, where do we support them then? So that's where the language sampling comes in. We look at, where all of their utterances are. You mentioned this, looking at these percentages. So we would score each utterance, each word or phrase that we're hearing as a stage 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or beyond, wherever it's falling. And then we want to support them where they're at the most. So if their highest percentage is stage 2, then we're going to support them there and moving into stage 3, for example. But yeah, sometimes it does ebb and flow. Like they're in stage 2 quite a bit, and then the next month we're hearing a lot more stage 1, and that can be scary for parents. But language ebb and flows. Maybe that month your child started a new school and they are really dysregulated. When kids are stressed or dysregulated, or GLPs in general, we're going to go back to our gestalts because they're easier to access. It doesn't take such a mental load to access this quick gestalt versus creating our own grammar or creating a mitigation or anything beyond that. So sometimes it's just a sign that they're going through a mentally stressful period, and it often changes. But yeah, we can get caught up in those stages. But I think they're great for informing and understanding why we support kids in the way that we do. Why are we giving GLPs in stage 1 more gestalts? Why can't I just give them single words that they can start building with? So knowing that once they get to stage 3, then they'll see those single words and be able to build with them. But for now, to get them to stage 3 and to get them to that place, we have to start with gestalts. In stage 1, we support them by giving them more gestalts. Then they break them down in stage 2. And then and only then are they ready for that isolation of words and building, piecing together of words. So I think just having a general idea of the framework can help parents and therapists to understand like what the heck we are doing in these early stages. Because it's only for GLPs that we're feeding them like phrase level stuff at an early age. I think it's mostly helpful to just understand the supports that we're using, and then just generally track progress. But every kid's journey through the stages looks different. If your child's minimally speaking or has apraxia of speech, it's going to look so different. Kids who are AAC users and don't speak, still can move through the NLA stages, and you might see the progression just on their device. So it can look so different for everyone. Yeah. But overall, it's a good thing to at least understand generally. So hopefully that gave you guys some better understanding of what the NLA stages are that we mentioned. I'm trying to think if there's any other background stuff that might be helpful. We know what a Gestalt language processor is, how it compares to analytic language, the NLA stages.
I think it's going to be something where we will continue to update you all on best practice in each stage. Like I know Katya and I talk extensively about how to support our GLPs in each stage. And so you'll hear episodes from us about, supports for stage 1, supports for stage 2, stage 3, and beyond. And we'll definitely highlight and go deeper, do a deeper dive into the stages, because I think that there's so much to learn within each stage that they should each be their own episode that everybody can go back and reference, right? So I think this is a great starting place for anybody who's just like, wait, I just need a refresher, or I need some basic background understanding. But yeah, I think it's helpful to know that both analytic language processors and GLPs are moving toward self-generated conversational communication, right? The process just looks a little different, but both are natural, and we can support kids and meet them where they are. And maybe we'll have an episode on dual processors, because we're starting to learn more about this kind of dual processing individual who, maybe acquires language in chunks and also has some single words and also kind of has characteristics of both of those styles. I know that that's been a topic that's come up a lot, and we're definitely staying on the pulse on that one, right? And trying to continue to learn and evolve, because I think, one thing that we have to give ourselves credit for, both me and you, Katya, and also everybody listening, is that they didn't teach us this shit in grad school. And yet we have had to uncover this on our own and really do the work to learn it. And so we're all evolving and trying to more deeply understand our kids and support them better. So as we learn, you'll learn. And the more that we know, the more that we'll share. So I'm looking forward to those episodes. I actually, in my training today, two of the adults that were there were both like, yeah, I'm a GLP. Like, this makes sense. This is exactly how I acquired language. And one, I think the other adult told me that her partner or her spouse is a GLP. So there's so much for us to learn. So many adult autistic people and adults who are GLPs are coming forward and sharing their lived experience. We have so much to learn and to continue to dive into. But I think that you explained the stages so succinctly that I'm hoping that everybody has walked away with a little bit of that background knowledge that will help you when you're listening to us talking in future episodes. So you'll have something to build on.
Yeah, and if questions come up, you can always email us, podcast@greatlanguagepartner.com. We're going to do some Q&A episodes. I already have quite a few questions gathered from listeners for us to answer, so that will be fun. One of them was on dual processing, like you mentioned, and I don't think
Ooh.
you even saw that. So
No, I didn't.
we will definitely answer the question related to that. And yeah, we've been getting some really good ones. You guys always make me think as well. But yeah, we're all learning together, and Gestalt language and our knowledge of the NLA stages is based on years of longitudinal research, and that is still being gathered, because as we go, we're learning more from kids, and kids are changing as time goes on. There's more access to media as life changes, that changes how we support GLPs and the information we have and what their movement through the stages looks like. So we're always learning from those who are in the trenches with us, and yeah, continuing to stay on top of that and share it with all of you and learn from all of you as well. So hopefully it was helpful.
And we'll get to those questions soon. So look out for that episode, and we will talk to you all soon. Bye.
Bye. I love to wake up